Good afternoon, boys and girls, friends, lovers, children of all ages. My name is Brian Loma. We are here today because you want to see the report, the investigation and recommendations. In approximately 8 minutes, we'll be joining the Aurora TV station, Channel 8 in Aurora, for a public broadcast of the investigation and of the reports and the recommendations. I'm going to cover a few things that I think you all need to know. At 10:43 p.m. on August 24th, 2019, 23-year-old Elijah McClain was approached by Aurora police officers and told to stop while he was walking home in Northwest Aurora. He was wearing a ski mask, a jacket, and long pants. A passerby had called 911 and reported a suspicious person who appeared to be walking and waving his arms, but reported seeing no weapons and not being in any fear of harm. 3 Aurora police officers responded. At 11:01 p.m., 18 minutes after he was first told to stop, Mr. McClain was lifted unconscious onto a gurney and then transported to the hospital. He never recovered. Mr. McClain was not armed during the encounter, nor had any suspected crime been reported when Aurora police officers stopped him that evening. In July of this year, City Council commissioned this report. The report is the independent work of 3-member panel of policing, constitutional law, and emergency medical experts, referred to as the panel. They do not represent the family or the estate of Mr. McClain, the Aurora Police or Fire Departments, the officers, or any individuals, or the city. They are independent. It was funded by the city, and the scope and objectives of the investigation were established by resolution of the City Council, the money provided by the city. The city facilitated the panel's request for information, but did not limit or control the investigations, findings, recommendations, or the contents of the report. None of the panel members had a prior or existing relationship with the city, the family of Mr. McClain, the police, or the fire departments, or the officers involved. The report is the work of the panel, aided by pro bono counsel Latham and Watkins, LLP. No one other than the panel members and their counsel have reviewed the report prior to its submission in completed form. This is a 157-page document, folks. For those of you who are following, 157 pages of tragedy. Shortly, we're going to be joining a live broadcast, a WebEx or Zoom style meeting where nobody is allowed to be in the chambers of the Aurora City Council. The city council members are not present. There will be no access to the faces of the council members other than what is broadcast on the television today. But we want to recognize that as a basis for its findings, the panel did rely on footage from body-worn cameras of the police officers who responded to the scene, their videotaped statements, follow-up reports. Whoa, I just lost a whole bunch of stuff. Audio, completed computer-aided dispatch reports from the night, other department reports and summaries. They also reviewed interviewed personnel. Their requests to interview the officers and fire personnel involved in the incident were denied, though. A more thorough description of their process and the materials is contained in the report. And again, if you're watching this live stream, there is a availability in the link to get the report, all the stuff that's there. They're gonna talk about their decisions to stop, to frisk, to apply force. The decision to apply force in response to the threat or perceived threat that Mr. McClain reached for an officer's gun. Officer Rodema can be heard saying, "He grabbed your gun, dude. Stop, dude. Dude." That's not cool. As soon as they declared, "Oh, he's trying to take your gun," it changed the response and the way they decided to handle it. The application of a second cardioid hold while Mr. McClain was on the ground. Because in the seconds after they took him to the ground the first time, they showed that they were struggling with him. They pinned him. They put him in a bar hammerlock. These are real facts. And we're going to hear more about this shortly. From the presenters themselves. So we're going to see if we can change the screen we're sharing here. Sorry, folks. We're struggling as much as we don't have to. All right. So there's a lot of things going on here. I want to make sure that I try to get into the chat real quick. Businessman, good to see you here. Frank Sturgell, Swedish Sugar in the comments. We're going to join the existing broadcast by changing the share screen. I think. Let's see what we can do here. Boom. There we are. Now, do we have volume? What does the volume look like? All right. So we've got picture in picture. We've got volume at the greatest amount. So this meeting that we're about to have, folks, is a to city council meeting, right? We're going to try to see if we can stay on that city council meeting. It's going to be quite interesting. There are ways to connect with Aurora City Council. And as you know, right now, Denver has a gathering happening as well. So there's going to be questions and the big arguments, and all of us are going to want to know these things. One of the things that I hope that you're looking for today is an understanding of whether the officers actually feared for their lives or if they were just a bunch of cocksuckers. Oops, did I say that out loud? And I say that because we have to remember that Elijah McClain was a non-violent human being who played his violin for cats. He had headphones on and he was dancing when the police officers approached him. Was he a bad person? Absolutely not. Was he committing any kind of crime when this happened? Absolutely not. So I want to just take a moment to say again, hi to Robert, to Ricky, to Wildlife Wanda, Swedish Sugar, Frank Sturgell. I see the Fens in here on the chat boxes. Freddie Show and News. If you want to know what was wrong with watching the murder of George Floyd and the protests that erupted afterwards, with the world today and why people responded in the way they did. Rob B1, White Wolf, the story of Elijah McClain is that story. The understanding that this young man was doing no harm, but somebody on the side of the road driving by, not having personal interactions, not having been in the store, to our knowledge, been directly involved, had a conversation with, just driving by. So when the cops show up, do they actually think they have the right to use force? Let's find out.
2021 is now called to order. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Kaufman.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Bergen. Here. Councilmember Berzins. Here. Councilmember Coombs. Present. Councilmember Gardner.
Here.
Councilmember Gruber.
Here.
Councilmember Hiltz. Here. Councilmember Lawson. Here. Councilmember Johnston. Here. Councilmember Mercado.
Present.
And Councilmember Murillo. Present. Okay, there's a quorum.
The only issue on tonight's agenda for this study session is the results of the 6-month independent study, independent investigation on the circumstances surrounding the Elijah McClain incident of August 2019. The presentation will now proceed, and we will take questions at the end of the presentation. I want to inform council members at this time that we will have to conclude at 6:20. The staff needs 10 minutes to set up for our meeting, our regular meeting at 6:30. Please proceed with the presentation.
The presenter's microphone is muted.
Report for the presentation. Please proceed.
Katie, is there a way to unmute him?
We're working on that right now. Hold on one second. I'm not sure what's going on. You are now unmuted.
Good evening.
No sound. Press the *6.
What do I need to do?
Maybe the *6 to unmute. We can't
We can hear you now. We can hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Council, good evening. I'm Jonathan Smith. I'm the chair of the panel engaged to review the incident on August 24, 2019 between Elijah McClain and the Aurora Police Department and emergency and medical response teams. On behalf of my fellow panel members, we thank the Aurora City Council and Aurora government leadership for this opportunity. We commend the city for taking this step to provide transparency, which is critical to building trust with the various communities that make up the city of Aurora, Colorado. On August 24, 2019, Elijah McClain was walking on Village Street in Aurora, Colorado. At approximately 10:40 in the evening, he was approached by police. Over the next 18 minutes, Mr. McClain was taken into custody, restrained, subject to an attempted carotid hold, and then a second successful carotid hold, injected with the sedative ketamine, and suffered a health crisis from which he did not recover. He died a few days later. The incident was investigated by the Aurora Police Department and reviewed by the Adams County District Attorney. One officer was found to be in violation of policy for threatening Mr. McClain with a dog bite. All other uses of force were deemed lawful and within policy by the department and the county district attorney. Community concerns about this incident and other allegations of police misconduct led the city council to, in July of 2020, commission this team to review the incident. We were charged with, first, an examination of the facts surrounding the Aurora Police Department and Aurora Fire Rescue's contact with Mr. McClain. Second, an examination of all relevant and related Aurora Police and Fire Department policies, procedures, and practices, to include those related to calls for service, police contact with individuals, use of force, calls for medical assistance, ketamine use, and administrative incident reviews. And third, the final report setting forth the investigation's findings and recommendations for best practices for the City of Aurora's consideration as it moves forward. We delivered that report to the city this morning. This investigation is one of 7 proceedings looking at this incident. In addition to our work, there's a state criminal investigation, a state pattern and practice investigation, a federal criminal investigation, the city's receiving technical assistance from the firm 21CP, and civil rights and tort litigation. Due to these investigations and other proceedings, the panel did not reach any conclusions about whether any of the individuals involved violated policy, the law, or should be subject to civil liability. We leave those determinations to the other proceedings underway. Our work is completely independent of each of these proceedings. No one from the city or any other entity reviewed or otherwise influenced our conclusions or findings. The conclusions are those entirely of the panel and the panels alone. The panel consisted of Chief Roberto Villasenor. Chief Villasenor served in law enforcement for 35 years. He retired as the chief of the Tucson Police Department in 2015. Among his many achievements, he was appointed by President Obama to serve on the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, and he's currently consulting on police reform with agencies across the country. Dr. Melissa Costello. Dr. Costello is an emergency medical physician in Mobile, Alabama. She has written and taught extensively on emergency medicine and serves on a trauma critical care team for the United States Department of Health and Human Services. She's a fellow of the American College of Emergency Physicians and a fellow of the National Association of EMS Physicians. I am Jonathan Smith. I am the Executive Director of the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Urban Affairs. I formerly led the Special Litigation Section of the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice. I've been practicing civil rights and anti-poverty law for more than 35 years. The panel was represented pro bono by the law firm of Latham & Watkins. The panel is extremely grateful for the tremendous contributions the firm made to this investigation and the preparation of the report. The panel reviewed all the available information, including body-worn camera videos, major crime unit investigation interviews, the reports of the major crime unit, the Force Review Board, the reports of the state attorney, the officers' reports, the autopsy report, the EMS reports, the directives, training materials, standard operating procedures for the department, and we had interviews with department leadership. We were not able to interview any of the officers or medical personnel involved, which is understandable given the other proceedings underway. that we were not able to review the hospital medical records because of privacy concerns. Tonight, the panel will provide you with a summary of our conclusions and recommendations. We are also prepared to answer any questions you have. Recognizing that the report is lengthy and detailed, we'd be willing to be available to answer additional questions of the city or the council at a future appropriate time. I will first take you through our conclusions regarding the facts and place them in the context of the department's policies and the legal framework. Dr. Costello will then discuss the response of the emergency medical teams, their assessment, and the administration of ketamine. Chief Villasenor will present regarding our review of the post-incident investigation and recommendations for policy, training, supervision, and accountability changes. I will then return to discuss areas of concern that we identified during our investigation, but are not part of our findings. We will be then available to respond to questions. Our report and our presentation tonight is organized around key decision points. These include the 911 call and the decision to dispatch officers, the decision to stop Mr. McClain, the decision to frisk Mr. McClain, the decision to arrest Mr. McClain by physically restraining him and moving him, the decision to apply force in response to the threat, a perceived threat that Mr. McClain reached for an officer's gun, the decision to apply a second carotid hold when Mr. McClain was on the ground, the continuous use of pain compliance techniques, and the contrast between the officer's assertions and Mr. McClain's audible statements, the transfer of Mr. McClain from police to EMS, the assessment of Mr. McClain by emergency personnel, and the decision to administer ketamine. At 10:29 p.m. on August 24, 2019, a call came to the 911 dispatch. A young man told the operator that there was a man in a mask walking southbound on Building Street. The caller said that the man put his hands up and did all these kinds of signs when the caller passed him. The caller said that he, quote, looked sketchy, end quote, and that he might be a good person or a bad person. The caller told dispatch that neither he nor anyone else was in danger, and that as far as he knew, the man was not armed. The dispatch reported this as a suspicious person call and sent 3 police officers. Dispatch told the officers to, quote, cover a suspicious party at Evergreen Avenue in Billings. It's a black male wearing a black ski mask and brown long sleeve shirt, black sweatpants, who's waving his arms when 911 caller passed him. Think that's strange. No known weapons are involved. The officers responding were Officer Woodyard, Officer Rodima, and Officer Rosenblatt. Mr. McClain was 3/10 of a mile from his home at the time. Officer Woodyard was the first to arrive on the scene. He parked his car briefly across the street and waited for Officer Rodima and Officer Rosenblatt to arrive. Mr. McClain was walking down the street with a bag in one hand and a phone in the other. Once the other officers arrived, Officer Woodyard pulled across the street from Mr. McClain, got out of his car, and told Mr. McClain to stop. I'm going to show you now 2 videos of what happened next. First, the body-worn camera video of Officer Woodyard.
Stop right there. Hey, stop right there. Stop. 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 I have a right to stop you because you're being suspicious. Turn around. Turn around. Turn around. In favor, stop. Stop right there.
Following his body-worn camera video of Officer Rosenblatt at the same time appeared approaching Mr. McClain from behind. Because of the buffering, the video, and I apologize for the volume of the video, the sound on this video will not come through. This is the only portion of the body-worn camera video that we'll be showing this evening. The video of what happened next is hard to watch. Out of respect for Mr. McClain, his family, and those who knew him, we will describe the events as shown on the video rather than play the video. The videos are publicly available for those who wish to review them using a factual portion of our report as your guide. As you can see from the video clips that I just showed you, Within fewer than 10 seconds from getting out of his car, Officer Woodyard physically grabbed Mr. McClain's arm. Very shortly thereafter, Officer Rosenblatt grabbed his other arm. During this time, Mr. McClain told the officers to, quote, stop, end quote, to let me go, and, quote, you guys started to address me. I was stopping my music to listen. Now let go of me. Rather than let Mr. McClain go, the officers continued to restrain him. It is important to note that neither the caller nor any of the officers identified a crime that they thought Mr. McClain had committed, was committing, or was about to commit. A police officer may initiate a voluntary encounter at any time, and it does not implicate the Constitution if any reasonable person would understand that they are free to go. An investigative stop, often called a Terry stop after the landmark case of Terry v. Ohio, is considered a significant intrusion on individual liberty and is protected by the Fourth Amendment. For an officer to compel a person to stop for the purposes of conducting a Terry or investigative stop, the officer must, under the federal Constitution and Colorado law, have reasonable suspicion that the person had committed a crime, is committing a crime, or is about to commit a crime. Moreover, she or he must be able to articulate or state the basis relied upon to make the stop. As will be discussed later in greater depth in this presentation, the major crimes investigators failed to ask the officers involved what basis they decided to convert the encounter from a voluntary one to an investigative stop to the use of physical force. There's much discussion in the report of the major crimes investigation that the officers stopped Mr. McClain because he was suspicious, that he was wearing a ski mask and heavy clothing, was in a high crime area, and that Mr. McClain did not stop when asked by the officers. Under the case law, which we discuss in the report, none of these factors alone or together amount to reasonable suspicion. In this regard, it is worth pointing out a few things. First, Mr. McClain was free to continue on his way unless the officers had reasonable suspicion to stop him. The notion that his failure to stop when asked creates reasonable suspicion renders the notion of a voluntary encounter a nullity. It cannot be that you are free to leave until you choose to exercise that right, and that your decision to leave provides the basis to compel you to stay. Second, the area was not in fact a high crime area. As this map shows, the area in which Mr. McClain was stopped by the police ranges from low to medium activity for crime. Third, that evening the temperature was in the 60s and Mr. McClain was wearing a light jacket. We don't know why he was wearing a ski mask, but as the video shows, most of his face is visible, and the wearing of a mask without some evidence of criminal conduct is not enough to establish reasonable suspicion. Fourth, when Sergeant Leonard arrived on the scene, he repeatedly asked why Mr. McClain was being restrained and whether there was any allegation of criminal conduct. He even sent Officer Ward to call 911, the 911 caller, to determine if he saw anything criminal. Upon learning that there was no assertion that Mr. McClain committed a crime, he did nothing to change the conduct of the officers. The officers told the major crimes investigators that they grabbed Mr. McClain because they wanted to conduct a frisk. Officer Woodyard stated that he decided to conduct the frisk even before he got out of his car, and that he waited for the other officers because he did not want to conduct the frisk alone. The authority to conduct a frisk is a separate legal analysis from the authority to conduct a stop. If an officer has reasonable suspicion to conduct a Terry stop, she or he may conduct a frisk only if the officer has reasonable and articulable suspicion that the person is armed and dangerous. During his interview with the major crimes investigator, Officer Woodyard provided the following justification for his decision to frisk. At this time, Officers Rosenblatt and Rodema, they are to the south of him and they're walking up, so I felt safe making an approach. He didn't have any weapons or anything I could see in his hand. And then when I went up to try to grab him, my position of advantage was his wrist and elbow. He tightened his arms up and put them to his chest, so I held my hand to his chest while trying to talk to him. Officer Rosenblatt grabbed his right arm and I had his left. I'm trying to tell him to calm down and wanted to pat him down for weapons based on him having a ski mask on Colfax in the middle of the night, and it was causing people to call in. I thought that he might have weapons on him. The major crimes investigator, and as far as we can tell, no one else, ever asked Officer Woodyard why he thought Mr. McClain may have weapons on him. In our report, we focused significant attention on the decision to stop and the decision to frisk. These decisions and the intended uses of force set in motion the events that followed and led to the increasing and persistent use of force. Events unfolded very quickly. At some point, the Terry stop of Mr. McClain was converted to an arrest. The officers told the major crimes investigator that they decided to move him off a rocky area and onto the grass because they thought they needed to, quote, take him down, end quote. Officer Rosenblatt told Mr. McClain, quote, let's get over to the grass, gonna lay you down, end quote. Officers need only reasonable suspicion to conduct a Terry stop. While conducting a Terry stop or a frisk, an officer is authorized to use a limited amount of force to effectuate that stop, so long as such steps are reasonably necessary to protect their personal safety and to maintain the status quo during the course of the stop. However, if officers use more force than is necessary to protect officer safety and maintain the status quo, the Terry stop is converted to an arrest. Once a Terry stop transforms into an arrest, the officers must have probable cause that the individual committed a crime in order to continue the detention. Probable cause is a higher standard than reasonable suspicion necessary for a Terry stop. The use of forceful techniques, which include taking an individual to the ground, generally turn a Terry stop into an arrest unless the officer can justify the force based on articulable grounds that the person is armed and poses a danger to the officer or others. None of the officers articulated the grounds for which they had probable cause to arrest, and none were ever asked by the major crimes investigator or others. At this point, less than a minute after the officers first approached Mr. McClain, force has been used against him to conduct a Terry stop, to attempt a frisk, and to effectuate an arrest. I've spoken a bit about the constitutional framework to consider these actions. It's important to note as well that the Aurora Police Department speaks to this question. At the time, Directive 5.3 required, quote, when practicable, officers will attempt to de-escalate their force and or the situation so that lesser force or possibly no force is required, end quote. No effort to de-escalate appears from the records available to us, nor were the officers ever asked about their efforts to de-escalate. We know that the department has changed its policy since Mr. McClain's death with regard to suspicious person calls to require that officers stop and observe before initiating an encounter to be certain that there is, in fact, a lawful public safety basis for stopping an individual. That new policy will be discussed later in this presentation in greater depth. After the officers began moving Mr. McClain from the sidewalk, Officer Rodema told the officers, quote, he grabbed your gun, dude, end quote. Officer Rodema told the major crimes investigators that he saw Mr. McClain reach for Officer Rosenblatt's gun. The officers then struggled to restrain Mr. McClain. Officer Rosenblatt attempted a carotid hold. When he released the hold after concluding that he could not accomplish it because he was in, quote, a bad position, end quote, Officer Woodyard wrestled Mr. McClain to the ground. It is important to note that this happened within a matter of seconds. Case law has held that a suspect grabbing or attempting to grab an officer's gun authorizes officers to use force up to and including lethal force, because a suspect who is able to gain control of an officer's weapon poses a grave risk to officers and others. The body-worn camera video at this point is scant because Officer Woodyard's and Officer Rosenblatt's cameras have been knocked to the ground. The audio and the subsequent interviews indicate that any threat or perceived threat was dissipated quickly when Mr. McClain was taken to the ground by Officer Woodyard. Once Mr. McClain was wrestled to the ground, he was lying on his side. Officer Woodyard was lying next to him. As Officer Woodyard described, chest to back. Officer Woodyard's gun was underneath him. While lying in this position, Officer Woodyard made a second attempt at a carotid hold. There's conflicting information on the audio of the body-worn camera video and in the interviews about whether Mr. McClain was rendered unconscious. One of the officers stated that Mr. McClain made snoring sounds. The panel notes that significantly, at the time of this incident, a carotid hold was considered less lethal force under Aurora Police Department policy. Section 5.8.3 permitted officers to apply a carotid hold when, quote, met with violent resistance and when lesser means have been tried unsuccessfully or other means are not feasible, end quote. Carotid holds have since been banned by the City of Aurora as a matter of policy. During his interview with Major Crimes, Officer Woodyard justified the use of the second carotid by reference to the prior attempt or perceived attempt by Mr. McClain to reach for an officer's gun. By his own statements, however, that threat had been dissipated. They were both on the ground, and Officer Woodyard was lying on top of his weapon. A determination of whether force is reasonable turns on whether the officers were in danger at the precise moment that the force was used. Police officers must calibrate their use of force to the actual resistance they are experiencing. As the level of resistance increases or decreases, the level of force authorizes increases and decreases accordingly. It is unclear from the record what current threat Officer Woodyard was intending to address when he applied the second carotid hold. Finally, I would like to talk about the use of pain compliance techniques. From the moment that Aurora police officers first encountered Mr. McClain, up until the time Mr. McClain was placed in the ambulance stretcher, officers applied some form of physical force against him. Even once it should have been obvious that Mr. McClain was not able to resist or escape, given both that he was handcuffed and the presence of multiple officers, the officers continued to use pain compliance techniques. Throughout, there were times when officers could be seen on body-worn camera footage adjusting and intensifying arm bars and wrist locks, or pressing down on Mr. McClain's back or large muscle groups, causing him to cry out in pain while they were on top of him. These appeared to be in response to almost any movement on Mr. McClain's part. The officers justified the continued use of force on the grounds that Mr. McClain continued to resist the officer's commands and showed extraordinary strength. The audio captured by body-worn camera video contains two sharply contrasting narratives. This is some of the most difficult audio to listen to. If you choose to listen, I urge you to pay close attention to what Mr. McClain is saying and what the officers are saying and doing. On the one hand, Mr. McClain is pleading and apologizing and expressing pain. He complained several times that he could not breathe, and at one point, an officer was instructed to get off his chest. Mr. McClain can be heard saying, "I have no gun. I don't do that stuff. I don't do any fighting. Why are you attacking me? I don't believe in guns. I don't even kill flies. I'm not a vegetarian. I don't judge people for anything. I respect all life. Forgive me. All I was trying to do was to become better. I'll do it. I'll do better to help all life. I will do anything I have to. Sacrifice my identity. I'll do it. You are all phenomenal. You are all beautiful. Forgive me." On the other hand, the officers continued to perceive resistance, telling Mr. McClain to stop moving and discussing various uses of force to restrain Mr. McClain. It is unclear whether Mr. McClain's movements, interpreted by the officers as resisting, were attempts to escape, or simply efforts, voluntary or involuntary, to avoid the painful force being applied on him, or to improve his breathing, or to accommodate his need to vomit. The officers' use of force did not appear to relent even after Mr. McClain was in handcuffs, became progressively more ill and less responsive, and surrounded by a large group of officers. None of the officers who continued to apply force after Mr. McClain was restrained was asked to explain their continued use of force. The case law makes clear that force is authorized to meet the resistance at the time that it was applied. The evidence available does not provide a justification for the near constant use of very painful force techniques. I will now turn it over to Dr. Costello.
Thank you, Jonathan. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So when we look at the point from which EMS arrives in this case, there's really two separate things going on. Jonathan has covered the police aspects of this very well. I will dig more into the EMS aspects of this. And as we looked at those, there were several categories of findings in which we identified issues and areas where we feel that Aurora Fire Rescue, or both Aurora Police Department and Aurora Fire Rescue together, can effectuate improvements in the interactions with future patients in this system. One of the things that we identified that's been brought up in other places as well is that there was a delay in the transfer of control of this patient from the police to the EMS system. Another is the lack of clear communication and the possible loss of information between the police officers and Aurora Fire Rescue as they took over care. The delayed and incomplete assessment of Mr. McClain, which we'll discuss, the failure to obtain appropriate equipment and have that at Mr. McClain's side, an inaccurate estimation of Mr. McClain's weight, and then ultimately I'll discuss a little bit about some of the cognitive errors that I saw evidence of here and how those play a role in medical decision making. You can go ahead. So in discussing the issue of transfer of patient control, there's always in these cases a transition between when a patient who is either a subject or a suspect, in Mr. McClain's case, he was a subject of a police investigation, ultimately has to become a patient. And the point at which that occurs is not always black and white as far as the timing. However, in this case, there was some evidence that there was a delay in that transition. The transfer of control, really the transfer of authority over what's happening at that scene, has to occur for a person to change from a subject of the police investigation to a patient that is under the control and authority of EMS, and who then falls under the authority of the medical director and the paramedics and EMTs working under that person's license. In this case, EMS arrived about 6 or 7 minutes before they actually initiated some hands-on contact with Mr. McClain. There's several images on the body camera footage of them standing back and observing. And while there is a lot of information that can be gleaned from observation, it is a concern of mine and of the panel that they did not press forward and initiate some contact with him in the form of transitioning him to becoming more of a patient. There was certainly some deference to the officers, even after the sedation had occurred. There was some discussion back and forth, and it's difficult to say whether that was deference to the police officers on the scene or whether that was efforts at collaboration. It's always important for these departments to work together. And it is invaluable when they can work together seamlessly. However, in this case, the transition was not seamless, and it didn't occur in a way where I feel like EMS clearly had the opportunity to step in and do some evaluation that I think was necessary. In some of our discussions, we came across this culture. Chief Gray was able to summarize it best, but we came across this culture of the concept that the patient isn't a patient until the police say they are. And that's something that came through both in our interview with the chief, but also in the interviews with the paramedics who were on scene and in some discussions about the culture of that department. You can go ahead. So this is one of the photographs that I captured off of the body-worn camera footage. And what you're seeing is Mr. McClain is on the ground below this. And then these are the four members of the fire crew who are standing back and observing, watching. And like I said, they would have been at this point in this position for several minutes. And this is about the time that the EMS crew from Falk arrives. Falk Ambulance is the transport crew. Aurora Fire Rescue does not transport patients. They do initial treatment and assessment. And for the patients that need to be transported, they're transported by Falk. So this was while they were waiting for Falk EMS to arrive, both to effectuate a transport of Mr. McClain and to arrive with the medications that they were going to require to sedate him. They had already made a decision to sedate at this point, and you can forward it. They had already made a decision to sedate at this point, and then there was discussion ongoing about the timing and how long things were taking, which I'll get into a little bit more later. This is an additional photograph of now the arrival of the Falk paramedics. So at this point, there's 5 medical personnel standing around this young man with the law enforcement officers having him in custody, and no one has initiated hands-on contact at this point yet. And so this is the point at which there should have been some initiation of contact, and the transition of authority really needed to have occurred prior to this point. So you can go forward. So in response to this, we felt like the recommendations that came through clearly were a need to clarify the policies and do more teaching and education on the transfer of authority from one agency to the other. Interagency relations are very important, but ultimately, all of those things have to be superseded by the importance of keeping patients safe. The culture within the departments needs to be one of patient advocacy and patient safety as the primary driver of all things that happen within these departments. And we really want to see Aurora Fire Rescue build a culture of patient advocacy. There is a duty to act policy and language within Aurora Fire Rescue, and that is a policy that allows them and compels them to step in if they're seeing things that are endangering patient safety on a scene. And with the initiation and with the passage of the duty to intervene legislation in Colorado that refers to the public safety officers, I felt it was important for them to review their duty to act policy within Aurora Fire Rescue and make sure that that language was in line with the stronger directives in the duty to intervene policy that governs law enforcement. So you can go forward. So there were several communication failures in this handoff when the handoff ultimately did occur. And one of the important pieces of research that is out there is about the difficulty in keeping all of the information that's relevant to a case cohesive and communicating all of that information in a way that both the sender and the receiver of that information hear and retain the same things. Every transition of patient care does involve a potential for loss of information, and there was some of that at play here. I'm going to play a video on the next slide of really what constitutes the entirety of the report that was from the police to the EMS agency and the information that they were working with at the scene. You got it, Jonathan. We should have audio. So this is the approach of the paramedic or of the basic EMT from that crew. There is about a 10-second interaction, which we're not hearing the audio on, so I apologize for that. But essentially they said that he'd had a carotid hold, that they had, he had some vomiting, and that the quote was, he was, quote, definitely on something, unquote. And that was it. That was the entirety of the discussion between now the person who is the lead police officer on that scene and communicated, unfortunately, to the junior most EMT on that crew. Whether any of that information ultimately made it to the paramedic is not clear. But what is clear through the interviews is that both paramedics did not recall having been told that, one, that there was a successful carotid hold with loss of consciousness, or that Mr. McClain had been unconscious at any point during this interaction. And so what we recommended, and you can go ahead to the next slide, what we recommended to address these things are to really research and develop within the departments together a handoff tool, whether that is a mental tool, whether it's a written tool, whether it's an electronic tool, some device or method by which all of the agencies who handle patient information, from Aurora Police to Aurora Fire, potentially to Falk, and then from Falk to the emergency departments, that all of those transitions of care are done in a uniform way so that all of that information is conveyed clearly and in the expected format and in the expected order. That way the people know if there's anything that's been missed. And then the other thing that came through in that video is the fact that there was a discussion that was happening on the side. There was this interruption of a patient care report that was offered, and then immediately another interruption in that discussion, along with everybody moving around. That level of distraction and that level of multitasking is one of the things that's been identified as a major issue in information loss when it comes to transitioning patients. And so the recommendation is that there be developed a formal process in addition to the tool, that there is even just 15 or 30 seconds where the receiver and the reporter on patient care information are giving each other undivided attention, so information is communicated clearly. You can advance. So when it comes to the delayed assessment and the incomplete assessment of Mr. McClain, by way of background, assessment is generally broken into both a primary assessment and a secondary assessment. The primary assessment is essentially a walk-up quick impression of what's going on, an assessment of a brief level of consciousness, is a patient responding or not, an assessment of essentially the basic ABCs, just like we all learned in CPR class, and is their airway intact? Are they breathing? Do they have a pulse? And then identifying major life threats, in this case, if they had life-threatening bleeding or if they had things that needed to be intervened on immediately. And then generally includes an assessment of vital signs. And the primary assessment is the one that lays the foundation for the clinical decision-making. Secondary assessment sometimes happens later, sometimes doesn't happen at all, depending on the circumstances. Sometimes it's very limited just to a specific complaint. If you have a broken leg, it's a very easy assessment. If you have a complex medical condition, it can be very complicated. However, what we really know is, and what we acknowledge in this report, is that limits of the ability for paramedics to do this and for EMTs to do this on scene is an everyday reality of working in the EMS environment. And really, we understand, and I understand in my experience, there are lots of patients who can't get a complete assessment. And that is a daily reality, both in EMS and in emergency medicine. Some patients are unconscious, and some patients are not cooperative, and some patients don't have the information that we need. And so the limitations in our ability to assess are definitely a reality. In this environment, when you're transitioning a patient from law enforcement control to medical control, it can be especially challenging because there is a need for support from both sides to do a medical assessment without compromising law enforcement's ability to maintain control and prevent injury, both of the patient and of all of the surrounding personnel. And so there is a reality that there are limitations. However, it was the feeling of the panel in this case that there was not enough limitation in their ability to access and assess Mr. McClain to justify the lack of assessment that was done. And so we offered several recommendations about that. And in addition, talked a little bit about that some of that deference and how that played into the delay in their assessment, and then the time pressures that they were feeling, whether it was because of the diagnosis itself. Once they had settled on a diagnosis of excited delirium, that diagnosis carries some time pressure inherent in it. In addition, there's probably some self-imposed time pressures, and then also some pressures from the surrounding officers and firefighters asking what was taking so long, and where was the ambulance, and put your head in and check and see what's going on. So all of those things led to the conclusions and the recommendations that we offer on the next slide. Essentially, it sounds very basic, but there's a lot here. It's the look at policies, procedures, and training surrounding patient assessment, with a differentiation specifically between basic assessment and between an assessment that should be a minimum standard for assessment of patients who are being sedated. In this case, there's certainly a reason that the assessment was limited initially. However, it was the feeling of the panel that we felt once a decision was made to effectuate sedation, chemical sedation, that should have carried with it a much higher threshold for trying to get in and do further assessment before sedation was administered. The onus is on the paramedic to do that assessment and to almost push in and be able to get that done for the safety of the patients. And the flip side of that, or the same side of that, is that because there is such an imperative that this assessment be done, at least in portions, prior to sedation, particularly because the sedation itself will interfere with the paramedic's ability to continue to get some of the assessment that helps them make a diagnosis, that training it to law enforcement should emphasize the fact that it is important for them to have adequate time and access to patients to assess them, particularly when those subjects that are with law enforcement are going to become patients of EMS. You go for it. So the equipment issue that we brought up was the failure to obtain the appropriate equipment. There were several places in the body-worn camera footage where I was looking for the appearance of equipment, the appearance of a monitor, the appearance of oxygen, and I did not see that throughout this encounter. There were some equipment pieces that arrived sporadically throughout, but not what I would traditionally have expected the crews that I supervise or other crews to bring to the side of a patient who is in this scenario. There is policy that clarifies what transport EMS crews are to bring when they respond secondarily to Aurora Fire Rescue, but we were not able to put hands on policy that identified what the Aurora Fire Rescue crews are to bring to the side of a patient when they are first on scene. My contention and the contention of the panel is that the presence of equipment could potentially have prompted further assessment. It's hard to stand over a bunch of equipment and not feel some compunction to begin to use some of that. Additionally, there was not a pre-sedation checkoff to verify that all of their equipment that they require for sedation under their protocol was present at Mr. McClain's side. And ultimately, what we found from the reports and information in the interviews is that one of those pieces of equipment, the capnography monitor, was actually not where it was supposed to be. It was ultimately in the ambulance, but it was not in the location that anybody expected, and there was a delay in application of that device, which could have provided some useful information over the course of his care. Ultimately, the cardiac monitors and other tools to assess vital signs were not applied until Mr. McClain was in the ambulance several minutes after his sedation, and unfortunately, at the point at which these were applied, he was already in cardiac arrest. And so we lost the opportunity potentially to intervene if there had been something indicated on the cardiac monitor that he was clinically declining. And so you can advance. And this resulted in several recommendations. The first being another, obviously, review of policy protocols and trainings to make sure that there's a complete pre-sedation assessment as far as can be done whenever feasible, including pre-sedation assessments of cardiac and capnography monitoring, with obviously the caveat that there are limitations to this, and we understand those exist in all of these environments. That said, the protocol gives a list of things that need to be completed in a post-sedation environment, particularly in excited delirium patients. And we found that list should be prioritized with particular attention to completion of all of the aspects of a primary survey that are not able to be completed in patients that require sedation early on in the process, particularly monitor application, because that provides so much valuable and useful information in patients that are clinically declining. The recommendation that surrounds that really is a strong recommendation for implementation of a manual checklist process. Chemical sedation of patients in this scenario and with the diagnosis of excited delirium is one of the events we refer to as a high-risk, low-frequency event in medicine. It's a terminology that's come out of several industries, but all of those industries that deal with high-risk, low-frequency events have implemented to varying degrees checklist processes. Anyone who has gone back and watched the Sullenberg interviews or read his book about the landing of the airliner on the Hudson can understand the importance of checklists and how they contribute to safety, even in scenarios where you're moving very quickly, and especially in scenarios where you're moving very quickly. You can go on to the next slide. So the inaccurate estimation of the weight. Mr. McClain's weight was overestimated by a large degree, depending on who was asked what his weight was. The weight estimates varied from a low of about 160 pounds to a high of 100 kilograms, which is 220 pounds, by all the various sources. At the time of his death, he was 140 pounds. The only consistent thing we found from all of the places that his weight was reported is that it was consistently overestimated. What we've looked at was the fact that, number one, I think a better assessment would have potentially helped in improving the estimate. I'm trying to speak over the conversation going on in the background.
Everybody mute their microphones. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Speaking of distractions. So I think a better assessment would have improved their weight estimate. One of the primary pieces of a primary survey when we talk about airway, breathing, circulation is the ABCDE. The D is the assessment of disability or their mental status, and the E is expose. It's get a look at the patient, either remove clothing or get a better sense of what's going on with the patient by exposing their skin or any of those things. And that was a step that was not done here prior to that sedation, and may have contributed to a better estimate on his weight. We then got into this cognitive shortcut of rounding and shortcutting the actual math that occurs in the dosing of ketamine. The small, medium, and large dosing, which you hear referred to and we discussed in the report, really leaves us in a place where we had an error in estimation, which was then compounded by a rounding issue that may be a perfectly valid tool, but doesn't comply with the way the protocol is written. And so those two things together combined to result in a dose of ketamine that was much higher than an actual weight and an actual mathematical calculation would have resulted in. That said, there is no definitive evidence that we found in this that ketamine had a role in Mr. McClain's death. His clinical status was declining prior to the administration of sedation. If anything, the ketamine may have contributed to some difficulties on the part of the paramedics after his sedation in assessing the fact that he was continuing to decline. But that decline that he was having was occurring before the ketamine was administered. Secondly, and more importantly, I think, is that there was not evidence from the coroner or any of the records that accurate dosing would have changed his outcome. Unfortunately, it is not a situation in which we can, fortunately or unfortunately, it's not a situation in which we can take this specific extra 140-ish milligrams of ketamine and place the blame there. It's just, that's not how this case had transpired. The important takeaway, though, is the implication that this has for future patients and for many, many of the medications that are used in the EMS environment that are all based on weight, because there is not the opportunity to weigh these patients in the field, particularly when they can't tell you how much they weigh. And there's a lot of medications that are weight-based. And so looking at this, go ahead, you can move forward. We made a couple of recommendations based on the issues here. One was to explore education and training on accurate weight estimation. The piece of this that came through in some of the reports is that there's good evidence that the weight of young Black men is consistently overestimated in medicine and in healthcare. And even just having that piece of information in the back of their mind will allow paramedics and EMTs to make a mental adjustment of an estimate that they're making to prevent that inherent overestimation that can occur in this population of patients and adjust for that. And being educated on that is enough to help offset that one place where this role of implicit bias rears its head in the medical environment. The other option is to give them other tools to verify an accurate weight. Driver's licenses and state IDs all have weight listed. The patients that can communicate can be asked. And then we wanted to ensure that there was consistency in the protocols across the whole department. We want to make sure that if they start teaching it one way, that it stays that way throughout. And if there are cognitive shortcuts, they need to be put in and implemented in protocol so that they are permissible under the rules. You can give me the next slide. Lastly, there were some cognitive errors that played a role here, and without getting into the gory details of cognitive decision-making in medicine, essentially, once someone has decided that a diagnosis is happening, there is a lot of mental energy that goes into looking for information that helps prove that diagnosis, and it is very, very difficult, even in very experienced clinicians, to separate themselves from that diagnosis and look at either information that doesn't fit or information that contradicts what they have already found. And the particular one that I was going to bring up, and I bring up in the report as well, is this concept of ascertainment bias. Ascertainment bias is when you go into a situation expecting something, and then you look for information that continues to prove your expectations. And the example that I give is the idea of a patient who's collapsed. If you were to close your eyes and picture for a minute that you're an EMT, and I'm going to send you out on a collapsed patient, and I tell you that piece of information I give you next is that patient collapsed in a football stadium. Or alternatively, I tell you, okay, that patient collapsed in an elementary school. Or that patient collapsed in a nursing home. And if you're picturing in your head what that patient looks like each time I change the setting or the scenario, if they collapsed in a bar, if I sent you because they collapsed at the jail, If your patient in your head does not look exactly the same in every one of those scenarios, then this is a little bit of that cognitive decision making that I'm talking about here. And this can allow an introduction of bias into clinical decision making, and it's important for medics to understand how that plays a role and the role that protocols have and the adherence to protocols have in diminishing the bias that can affect these decisions. You can go ahead. So our recommendations here are basically just to educate on cognitive errors in clinical decision-making, understanding the process of how this happens, that we want to continue to provide education on excited delirium. In the description, we get further into the idea of how these errors can lead to somebody giving a diagnosis like excited delirium and then only searching for information that validates that diagnosis and missing signs that there is potentially something else going on. The focused excited delirium education is important because it is such a unique entity within altered mental status or within behavioral problems or those issues that rolling it into other protocols or rolling it into other disease entities is potentially fraught with danger because you then roll that set of treatments into disease entities in which it's not appropriate. So the recommendation was to maintain a standalone excited delirium protocol. It is a subsection of a protocol that's appropriate, but it is a separate disease entity that if it's maintained that way will allow us to manage that specific illness as a unique entity and not confound it with other issues that may cause altered mental status or psychiatric or behavioral problems. There are some things ongoing. There's a ton of discussion around ketamine and EMS right now, and I think that over the next probably 6 to 12 months, there'll be some things coming from the state, there'll be some things coming from the federal government, and that Aurora will be well served to incorporate all of that into their findings and into changes in their protocol. Next slide. We did make some specific protocol recommendations. These are probably more interesting for the fire and EMS people who get down in the weeds on protocol. But there were some recommendations about cross-linking, improving the connections between protocols for situations when you move from one to another. The discussion of checklists for high-risk, low-frequency events and for specific complex tasks. And then there were recommendations around specific additions to the excited delirium protocol in Aurora that have been shown through the research to provide benefit to patients. Some of them are already in protocol and we just refined them, and some of them would be new additions. You can go ahead. And then there were a couple places I wanted to just say some positive things about the department as far as what I was able to witness and what we were able to see on the video and in our review. The sedation and the interaction itself was a low-frequency event. When Mr. McClain unfortunately had a cardiac arrest event and his heart stopped, it's clear from the video footage that dealing with a cardiac arrest scenario with a situation where a patient's heart has stopped and we have to take over CPR and all of those all of that resuscitation process, it's clear that this is a situation that the paramedics are very well trained for. The snippets of video and the resuscitation descriptions are a classic demonstration of PIC crew CPR, which is definitely a best practice and has been shown to improve neurologic outcomes in cardiac arrest resuscitation. That came through loud and clear that their training and education and experience with this is solid and is a best practice that's already ongoing. The second piece that we wanted to point out was their quality assurance and quality improvement process. The structure is based on just culture. It's a multidisciplinary, multi-agency quality review. It is something that occurs on a regular basis and is involved with their EMS physicians at a high level. And it is important to have that structure in place in order to ensure that there's a full, thorough look at patients in situations where there's a bad outcome and to identify ways that the system can improve. These reviews are peer review protected. They do have certain legal protections that allow the system to be able to improve without without outside eyes in order to be able to have full disclosure of events that go through this process. And so, as it pertains to Mr. McClain's case in particular, this was not something that I was able to review as part of the panel, or that the panel was able to review, was the results of the quality assurance process. And that is certainly a set of legal protections that I'm highly respectful of as a practicing physician, because we want to have events that we can look at and make sure that patients are safer without that level of scrutiny and exposure. So I think that's my last slide. Yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Roberto Villa Senior.
What I'll be talking about is the proposed incident investigation of the case by the New York Police Department. The major crime unit was assigned to the case, and on the video you can see Sergeant Leonard advising officers that this was going to be a major crime unit case because Mr. McClain had called out referring to the stopping of his heart while he was in the ambulance. At that time, he advised the involved officers to separate and not talk to each other, which is standard procedure when these type of events occur in order to try and preserve the integrity of the interviews. Upon arrival at the scene, the major crime unit was briefed on the incident by Sergeant Nugent, who was also another supervisor who was on the scene. The Aurora's major crime unit, along with Denver PD's major crime unit, both responded in fulfillment of a memorandum of understanding with the two agencies. This is an area where Aurora PD is progressive in joining with surrounding agencies to review these type of cases. Unfortunately, however, the assignment of an investigator from within the agency of the involved participants tends to water down that effort to make sure that the investigation is not biased. Detective Bingley from Aurora is assigned as the lead investigator. Next slide, please. Major crime unit initiates the investigation that involves the interview of the officers. They interview the police officers either the night of the event or a couple days after. Specifically, Officer Woodyard and Officer Rosenblatt were interviewed on August 25th, and Officer Rodenau was interviewed on August 28th. The officers were not allowed to view their body-worn camera prior to being interviewed. No other police officers were interviewed at that time, even though there were several other officers on scene while Mr. McClain was being held down on the ground, who could have given their perspective as to the level of resistance and what they observed. This was one of our first indicators of the concern that we developed as a panel of how the case was investigated and the absence of internal affairs as a component of the close investigation. The firefighters were not interviewed till sometime after the event. Specifically, firefighter Bradley was interviewed on September 9th. Lieutenant Chichuniak and paramedic Cooper were both interviewed on September 11th. These interviews were 2 weeks after the event. And then firefighter De Jesus was not interviewed until September 23rd, which is 4 weeks after the event. We felt this could be problematic because at this time the event had already become controversial, and there was a lot of publicity about the event. Having that much time passed since the event occurred takes away the spontaneity of the responses that you could get from the participants. And really, best practice would be that you would try and get those interviews done as quickly as possible. They had at least 4 detectives and 1 investigator respond to the scene that night. And if needed, between the 2 agencies, they could have brought more personnel out to conduct those interviews in a quicker time period. We also, in the review of this investigation, developed some concerns about the questioning and the leading nature of the questioning by major crime unit. The officers involved were not asked key questions, as we pointed out several times, about their conduct, the justification for their actions, their thought process of why they did what they did. Also, at times, the questions appear to be trying to generate what is looked at in the report as magic language, which comes from case law exonerating the use of force. Next slide, please. As an example of this, I took some excerpts of the interview of Officer Woodward by Detective Ingley, and I'll read them here. These are the words taken directly off of the recorded interview. Okay, and then you heard Officer Rodenau say, "Just going for your gun or going for a gun?" Officer Woodward says, "Yes." Detective Bingley says, okay, and how did that physically make you feel? Woodward replies, to be honest, kind of sick. Okay, besides sick, were you, what? And Officer Woodward then kind of ums, and Detective Bingley says, emotionally, how did you feel? What ran my emotions up? Next slide, please. Detective Bingley continues, okay, were you nervous? Yeah. Were you scared? A little bit, yeah. Okay, so was there fear within you? Yes, there was. Detective Bingley says, okay, both for your own safety and at that point Officer Woodward finishes saying, for my safety and the officers on scene. The leading nature of these questions and the quality posed, it raises concerns about trying to get the individuals to that location where they say the words that have been shown by case law that it does justify the use of force actions. Next slide, please. In addition, the report of the Major Crimes Unit, in the panel's opinion, somewhat stretched the record in an apparent attempt to exonerate the actions of the officers rather than present a neutral version of facts. For example, the report stated that the officers were there, quote, to check on his well-being, and that they attempted to explain to McClain why they wanted to talk to him and determine if he needed medical assistance. Nothing that we could find in the record, the video, or the interview support these assertions. The closest evidence in the record is that Officer Whittier stated that he would have stopped Mr. McClain even absent the call because he was acting strangely. None of the officers ever expressed concern that he might need medical help, and emergency medical services appears to have been summoned in compliance with the Aurora policy that whenever a carotid hole is applied, EMS must be called to the scene to do an evaluation. Furthermore, Detective Bingley wrote, Officers Rodima, Woodyard, and Rosenblatt continued to struggle with violently resisting McClain through their entire encounter, even after he was placed into handcuffs, unquote. And while it's true that at least one or two officers were in contact with Mr. McClain until he was placed on the gurney, the video and the audio did not support the claim that Mr. McClain was violent and resistant throughout the contact. But he could actually be heard crying, pleading, vomiting at times, and completely silent at others. Any movement on his part was met with swift countermeasure control holds or body pressure on major muscle groups, all of which appeared to cause further pain. It's unknown if the pain caused further movement on Mr. McClain's part, if this was a cycle that was generated, but what was clear is that the movement did not appear to this panel to be violent in nature once he was on the ground and angry. Next slide, please. Whenever there is a significant police event, including an in-custody death or observable shooting, the potential for critical impact to the community exists. The Department of Justice is so concerned about this event, they provided guidance to the COPS office, the New York Police Office, that says a criminal investigation of an agency employee, particularly one involving a felony or crime of moral turpitude, is so serious that an agency should consider extraordinary measures to ensure that the investigation is as thorough and independent of conflicts of interest as possible. Best practice usually accomplishes this by having internal affairs conduct an investigation looking at it from the perspective of policy and procedures, while the appropriate criminal investigative unit will review the potentiality of any criminal misconduct. That did not occur here. The goal of the major crimes investigation of an in-custody death, such as this one, like any other investigation conducted by the unit, focuses on the determination of whether a crime has been committed. This is a significant scenario when a potential suspect in a criminal misconduct that is being investigated as a police officer. In order to maintain any level of trust within the community, the investigation has to be above reproach. It cannot be perceived that the officer is being afforded any special consideration. On the other hand, the role of internal affairs is to protect the integrity of the agency by ensuring compliance with policy. Its standard is a civil one, not a criminal one, and as such, there are different rules that govern the investigation and the employee's actions. In part, again, the DOJ provide guidance stating that internal affairs should conduct all serious administrative investigations included but not limited to officer-involved shootings, in-custody deaths, alleged constitutional violations, allegations of racial profiling or discriminatory policing or racial prejudice, dishonesty, drug use, several other criminal violations, and then ends with, as well as cases referred directly by the agency head or command staff. Internal Affairs should also conduct all administrative investigations of allegations of misconduct that are likely to result in litigation against the agency or its members. Next slide, please. We also looked at the Force Review Board's role in evaluating the investigation. The Force Review Board started their review after the department received the declination letter from the Adams County District Attorney on November 22nd, 2020. 2019. Their decision appeared to be based in large part on the summary provided by Detective Ingley, which we already have mentioned above. In response to our inquiry about any other items reviewed by the Force Review Board, the police department informed us that the only thing that they looked at was the police reports and the body-worn camera videos provided with the summary report. Even so, they should have been concerned about the justification for the Terry stop, as we've indicated earlier, and the attempt to frisk based upon information in the reports and the video. The acceptance of the report and the lack of further inquiry or investigation is concerning, especially considering the controversial scrutiny the case was already receiving. The board met on January 28th, 2020 to discuss the case and declared that the officers were policy compliant on January 31st, 2020. Next slide, please. We felt that there were some recommendations that we could provide, and starting with training on constitutional requirements. The panel did not conduct a thorough review of all training and supervision of officers. That process is part of other ongoing investigations and reviews. However, we do recommend that the city look at providing training in a couple of areas as you see highlighted above. First, Terry stops and the role of reasonable suspicion. We have focused on this extensively in this report because the Terry stop, the original stop, and the lack of reasonable suspicion of any criminal activity started a chain of events that everything else flowed from. The speed at which the officers reacted and placed hands on Mr. McClain, the apparent failure to assess whether there was reasonable suspicion that a crime had been committed, and the unity with which the three officers acted suggests potential training or supervision issues in constitutional law surrounding Terry stops. Without assessing other incidents of the training program, the panel can't reach a definitive conclusion, but best practices would have dictated that the officers would have spent more time observing rather than immediately placing hands on Mr. McClain without a more particularized, objective basis to suspect Mr. McClain was involved in criminal activity. The panel also recommends that every Terry stop and every frisk be thoroughly documented. For each stop and separately for each frisk, the officer should be required to provide a description of the reasonable suspicion that justified the stop and the separate basis for the search. Each stop report must be reviewed for policy compliance, appropriateness, under the circumstances, and individual or agency approval. Excuse me. We also looked at the use of force and training possibilities there. We looked at the reassessing the necessity and amount of force, and that how much force should be applied based upon the level and threat and resistance being reduced throughout the contact. The unremitting use of force throughout this encounter and what appears to be a failure to allow Mr. McClain to comply after he was taken into custody raises concerns about whether officers have sufficient guidance on the need to reassess and assess the amount of force used once the level and threat of resistance is reduced. Oftentimes, best practices are called the continual decision-making model, where the officers are trained and taught about the need to constantly assess second by second what is going on. In addition, greater emphasis needs to be placed on the role of de-escalation in all potential use of force incidents. While the officers were repeatedly heard telling Mr. McClain to stop tensing up, to relax, to chill out prior to taking him to the ground, the fact that they were making these statements after they had already grabbed and controlled him without any reasonable suspicion of criminal activity somewhat defeats the spirit of de-escalation. Next slide. The post-incident review of the death of Mr. McClain is of serious concern to the panel and reviewed significant weaknesses in the department's accountability systems. The panel urges the city to consider overhaul of the post-incident review process to ensure that inadequacies are identified and addressed in policy, training, and supervision. The panel strongly urges the city to assess the training and supervision of the major crimes detectives as it relates to the investigation of potential criminal misconduct by police officers. Remaining objective and independent while investigating a fellow officer presents unique challenges. Both detectives and supervisors need special training to ensure that the investigations are both fair and complete. The panel believes that this case should be referred to Internal Affairs, as we said repeatedly, and strongly urges the city to consider the important role of Internal Affairs in reviewing an officer-involved death. While major crimes and homicide roles to determine whether a crime was committed, the role of Internal Affairs is to protect the integrity of the agency by ensuring compliance with the policy. The current policy of requiring that only the chief can open Internal Affairs investigations places the chief in a difficult position and limits the opportunity of review by the department for compliance with policy. The panel urges the city to reform the Force Review Board to provide a more critical and objective analysis of these uses of force. The failure of the board to examine the incident in detail and to look at each use of force against Mr. McClain separately and with care is a lost opportunity. The Force Review Board should be a critical part of continuous assessment and learning process, and every incident should be interrogated for what it can teach the department to avoid negative outcomes in the future. We do, though, applaud, next slide. We do applaud steps that Aurora PD has taken since this event. In June of 2020, the Aurora Police thoughtfully instituted the following policy changes, which address several of the issues we brought forward. First was being a ban on the use of the carotid order. This guidance is included in the policy of less lethal use of force, but we also recommend that it be repeated or at least cross-referenced in the Directive 503 use of force and deadly force and Directive 504 reporting and investigating use of force. Next is the policy dealing with relief of involved officers. The department has made an important change to a policy that requires that officers involved in a significant physical altercation be relieved once the altercation has ended by the first available officer who did not go hands-on. This change in policy is a positive step to ensure that any subsequent use of force be based on the actual resistance at the time and not on the prior conduct by the person being taken into custody. The implementation of the policy will reduce unnecessary uses of force and be safer for officers and members of the community. We also applaud the implementation of a bystander intervention policy. Policy states that sworn members shall, when in a position to do so, given the totality of the circumstances, safely and immediately intervene to prevent another sworn member from using physical force that exceeds the degree of force permitted by law. Appropriate action may include, but is not limited to, verbal or physical intervention, immediate notification to a supervisor, or a direct order by a supervisor to cease the use of unreasonable force. Finally, and we've talked about this earlier, the change in the policy on dealing with suspicious person calls. Upon arrival and locating a suspicious person, the responding member should take some time to observe the person unless there is something going on that requires immediate contact. Members should not rely solely on the reporting party's description to justify a contact, and members should use their training and observation skills to determine if the person is acting suspiciously and that the person was, is, or seems about to be involved in criminal misconduct. Turn it back over to John for areas of concern.
Of time, I will, if I may, just briefly, not make specific findings on, but were of significant concern to the panel. We've provided the city in our report with the discussion of the the research on implicit bias in law enforcement and delivery of emergency medical services. Well, from a single incident, it is extremely difficult without the direct evidence of bias to be able to assess bias. We did see indicators that we, in this incident, that would sort of advise the city to take a deeper look at implicit bias practices, training, and supervision. The perception of people of color is more threatening. The perception of people of color having unusual strength, indifference to the effective use of force, indifference to pain, delay in the administration of care, misperception of the dangerousness of neighborhood, misperception of age, size, and size of people of color. This is an area where further work needs to be done, and we would recommend that the pattern of practice investigation of the work being done by 21 CP would benefit from further exploration from looking at other incidents beyond the single incident. We also, there's nothing in the record to indicate that Mr. McClain was in behavioral mental health crisis. The fact that the call that was made to 911 suggested that Mr. McClain was acting bizarrely, strangely. The officers themselves, and particularly Officer Woodyard, indicated that he would have stopped to check on Mr. McClain's welfare. Did cause us to take a look at the crisis intervention system in Aurora. We did make some very specific recommendations. Aurora has adopted the CIT International model, but does not follow that model with fidelity. And we would strongly encourage a review of its policies, procedures to provide more guidance and greater fidelity to the CIT model. There's some very good specific material in CIT International materials. We want to congratulate the city for its adoption of a pilot of a CAHOOTS model, a non-law enforcement intervention model. And we would hope that at the conclusion of that pilot, that the city strengthen and support CAHOOTS approach. It's been successful in other jurisdictions, and we believe that it can be a tremendous benefit to the city of Aurora. And finally, Dr. Costello mentioned this earlier, as the city does its review of the use of ketamine, Dr. Costello has provided some commentary on the dangers and the alternatives to the use of ketamine. And in the course of that review, we encouraged the city to take a look at what its alternatives are as it moves forward to determine whether ketamine should be returned to usage in Aurora or there are alternative sedatives that would be used under any circumstances. With that, that concludes our formal presentation, and we would be prepared to answer questions now if the council and the mayor have them and there's time to do so.
You know, this is Mayor Mike Coffin. I would ask the panel if we could do this. That staff advised me that the time required by the panel was going to be much less than it was. And we need to start our regular meeting at 6:30. And so would it be possible to have an additional meeting where the public would clearly have access to the meeting, whether it's a special study session or however it is structured, but would the panel be willing to do that? Because this is very important to this city, and I don't want to rush the ability for members to ask questions.
I can speak for myself, and I'll let Dr. the chief speak for themselves. We'll be pleased to reconvene with the city or city leadership or with the council to answer any further questions.
Thank you very much. What I will do then is I'll look at the schedule and find time for another meeting. And thank you very much for all your work, for your presentation on an issue. We cannot move forward as a city unless we understand the problems that we've had. And so I want to thank you so much for your independent investigation into this, what was a horrific incident to our city and remains a wound in our city. And so with that, I'm going to conclude this particular presentation. And thank you very much. And we I will work with you on another date for a time that the members can be able to ask questions and not be rushed. And I want to thank Councilmember Hiltz for this recommendation that I've accepted. So thank you, panel, for all your work, and look forward to an additional meeting where we will have the ability to ask questions. With that, the study session is adjourned. We will reconvene in the regular meeting of the City Council at 6:30 p.m. Thank you, everybody.
Ho! That was some pretty intense stuff right there. Frank Sturgell, are you able to join us in a live chat? So we go like this. Let's see what we can do here. We're going to share a tab for now. I do want to talk about this cahoots thing that Michael Whitney brought up. And I got to tell you what, I'm a big fan of Dasher. This is the Denver Alliance for Street Health. I always get the last R wrong. Street Health Response. And they have worked primarily on building alternatives to policing in jails. So I want to tell you about Dasher. It's a really important group for me. You see this rabbit on the screen right now. We sell these masks. Frank, I'm still looking to see if you can pop in and join us for a chat on ketamine. I did pop that up there in the chat box. If you can click on that, thank you very much. But while we're waiting for Frank, we want to talk about Dasher. And Dasher, again, the Denver Alliance for Street Health Response. The rabbit is a mask that you can buy from Colorado Masquerade. That's comasquerade.org/shop. I believe that's the right website right there. And you can buy a mask with the rabbit on there. $5 of your purchase goes to Dasher. That is the fund that we're giving to help put this funded group out and meet with police officers, meet with city leaders, meet with city council members, groups and associations, police departments, fire departments, and teach the mentality that we need to be involved. I see you, Frank. There you are. How you doing, buddy?
All right.
I'm gonna just give this a second here for me, if you will. Dasher is called Star in Denver. They have a police van with Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 hours. But in 6 months, nobody's been killed. Nobody's gone to jail. Nobody's been shot. Lives have been saved. People are getting shelter and housing. And so creating alternatives to policing is the key. Getting money out of police departments and into services is what we really need to focus on. In Denver, we had to create a special tax just to have money to house people. But ketamine, Frank, this is what I really want to talk about. I don't know if I should go into my background and hunt up some of the core requests, the demands that you've done. But I really just want to give you a few minutes here because you've done a lot of research. You are possibly one of the top 5 experts. If not 5, you've got to be in the top 10 in the state of Colorado for the rules, for the laws, for the lack thereof. It was alluded to in the presentation that there would be some exciting changes when it came to ketamine in the next 6 to 12 months. And I can only imagine why there's going to be changes. So I'm going to give you the microphone for a second.
Okay. Yeah, I've done, I don't know how many hundreds of core requests on ketamine I've done since June, but I know I've got about 150 denials. So I've got plenty of material to be suing a lot of agencies. I started with West Metro Fire Department, and they reluctantly did comply with all my core requests, and then I said, why is West Metro Fire acting this way? And they were injecting people at almost an injection a day at that time, and now they're down to less than one every 3 days. So I started going with started requesting records from CDPHE and other fire departments, and it's really a situation where one group of medical doctors and within MPAC, which is the Emergency Medical Practice Advisory Council, is really taking over CDPHE, and they're supposed to be just advisory, and they are doing this for money, and it's a matter of finding the laundering that they're doing. I'm not using that word laundering loosely either, and that they are breaking law. The purpose of they hand out waivers to these fire departments so that they can have supposed to be under the supervision of a medical doctor that is given the title of medical director over these fire departments and paramedics, so that they can inject ketamine. But it's really supposed to be done at a per instance basis, and it's not. We have the technology where doctors really should be having a video call with these paramedics if there's any a situation of excited delirium, and these medical doctors are intentionally keeping paramedics in the dark on what excited delirium is. Like one of the things I noticed, Denver Health is actually the biggest user of ketamine and abuser, and CDPHE has a definition of excited delirium. The Denver police have a definition of excited delirium, which is the same as CDPHE's. Denver Health's paramedics do not. They don't have one in training, so they're keeping them in the dark as to what it is, so that these paramedics actually think they're doing something right when they're not. And it's really a small group of doctors that are actually pushing this, and from St. Anthony's Hospital and also St. Francis and Colorado Springs and UC Health and Denver Health are the main pushers.
So, Frank, you heard in the presentation that the paramedics, when they arrived, they did not take control of the scene in an effective manner. They did not have the expected medical technology to do a physical evaluation prior to the injection. And
one of the things that they need to do during those is one of the demands for excited delirium is hyperthermia, which means a really high body temperature, and they don't even check the temperature of these of these patients. They just go ahead and do it. That's the part of keeping these paramedics in the dark. Why aren't they demanded to take a simple body temperature with a temperature gun? It's really simple, but they won't do it.
So that's kind of one of the things the medical representative, who seemed to take up the majority of the time in the presentation, was like, didn't want to blame ketamine because she was the medical representative. Yeah. But she indicated that the medical professionals had a serious lack of training. Do you see or have you found that this lack of training is consistent? And
very consistent, yes.
So who's responsible to train these people?
CDPHE says each of these medical directors, which is a doctor with a new title, that really doesn't have a lot of meaning, is supposed to be training them, but it's a statewide waiver system. So why isn't CDPHE coming out with a packet to say, here, doctors, this is what we want to streamline the education, so to ensure that and CDPHE is actually the ones giving out the training and certification for paramedics. So why aren't they doing their job to educate and these paramedics on what excited delirium is, how to spot it, and CDPHE, out of all the more than 1,000 injections of ketamine for excited delirium that we've had in the past 3 years in the state, CDPHE doesn't have a single video of defining what excited delirium is, so that they can show it. So CDPHE has actually put in writing to me that these doctors are supposed to be ones doing it, putting together a training package. And what I'm finding at best what they're doing is even the ones that were just approved just 2 weeks ago, the waivers were approved for training just based on having a conversation with a paramedic, and with no materials to really help them make have any knowledge of what's going on, and not even training them on the laws of what what the waiver is supposed to be. What is the waiver is there to get around is to waive law in the Schedule 3 of both the FDA laws, the Controlled Substance Act, and our state Schedule 3 as well. So
let me ask you this, Frank.
What?
Let me ask you this. I've done a little research through the years of that we've been involved in our activism. One of the things that I hear you describing here is a scenario where a statewide agency who gives authorization for the use of chemical substances would have a platform to provide a concise and consistent training module so that the use of such drugs within the boundaries of the state would be consistent, and that single statewide entity would be able to be held accountable, or maybe the location where all the certifications for the training occurs. And I hear you describing the lack of it, and it reminds me of Texas, because when we looked into Rockwall, Texas, and we examined the First Amendment training that officers received, the city deferred to the state mandates, and that the statewide mandate was it wasn't lacking. There was a specific agency. They were held accountable to having online training, continuing education, renewal of your licenses, and the online database that showed every officer statewide. And that was a publicly searchable database.
Yeah.
You could request the information. They would provide it for that. It sounds to me like the exciting changes when it comes to ketamine should be that kind of accountability. Do you see the state currently bringing that in coming into that direction?
No, I don't. CDPHE has actually stated that they are in a legal bind, or if they do something right and come clean and say we're going to stop this, or whatever measures that they're going to take to come clean, that puts them in legal jeopardy. So that they're avoiding doing anything right and continuing the status quo that they know is wrong. And we have that on record. So one thing about how this waiver system works is that MPAC is an advisory council. They're only supposed to advise CDPHE, and so they advise CDPHE, the medical chief medical officer, and as the executive director. Chief medical officer right now is Eric France, and the executive director is Jill Ryan, and only those two people can approve of these waivers of any kind, and they are not doing that. And what's happening is Randy Kuykendall is an ex officio, meaning he's there just because he works for CDPHE. Is actually he's advised, so he's on MPAC, and he is the one approving the waivers. So he's not only advising himself, he's approving himself, and he is a former paramedic, so he's definitely tight into the circle of these waivers. And in the waiver system is primarily ketamine. You get rid of ketamine, you really don't have a waiver system left anymore. So
Okay.
it's a circle that is no one is saying, stop this, and hopefully the legislature will do so. There is going to be a bill put forward. I'm not too sure what the bill is going to include, though.
So in your viewpoint today, the report that you listened to here, you heard a specific statement that said basically ketamine didn't necessarily do this. We can't blame ketamine because we didn't get all the vital statistics before we injected the ketamine. It could have been the police. However, as one of the viewers here today clearly recognized, we're never going to be able to bring Elijah McClain back to life.
No.
But we do have a pivotal point in American and human history to determine what is humane treatment, what methodologies are expected as a minimum basis. Do you feel that even though the doctor deflected on the possibility of ketamine being the cause of death, that the report was honest?
I'd say it's probably 80 to 90% honest. As far as ketamine being the reason for it. I would say it still is. It is the reason why Elijah McClain died, because he did go into cardiac arrest, and that was what the autopsy said, he died from. Ketamine can put someone into cardiac arrest. A cardiac hold chokes you. It doesn't put to my knowledge, doesn't put anybody into cardiac arrest, but it will, take the oxygen out of, and asphyxiate people. So I'm still going with ketamine as the reason for Elijah McClain's death. And it also should be noted that Elijah McKnight, who's also filed a lawsuit in federal court, he was in a coma for 5 days. So, and Jeremiah Axtell's ambulance did pull over because he was in a cold blue, and he was but resuscitated back to life, because he was killed as well, but he was resuscitated in the ambulance. So there have been deaths. It's plural.
And that's the thing that I think we need to recognize. The overuse. How many did you say? Was one a day a minimum?
That's what West Metro was doing. Yes. Denver Health has a higher rate, but they will not say how many. They're keeping it secret. Even in their presentations at CDPHE, they still keep all their numbers secret as to how, and Denver Health has only responded to one core request, and then they sent an attorney after me saying that I'm harassing them, and I'm not, but I still continue to ask them. They do not respond. Now Centura has never responded. Centura has now blocked my Yahoo email address, so I'm using other email addresses now.
Well,
And
let's not go into the details of that too much, but I think that there's something that we can go into the details of, and that is how do people help? Because I think that what your work is, the reason that I think that Elijah McClain's life and his death is so catastrophically important to the process of humans in this world looking at what we do and how we respond to issues and treatment and policing and all these things ties to the research that you've done, because lawyers, city council representatives, medical professionals, they're all hearing you. But what I think is one of the things that we face is that there's not enough of us.
Yes.
And we need to duplicate the process. So if somebody was to want to do something and take direct action in their own hands, you've mentioned a couple of organizations, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, the private hospital systems that are around the state of Colorado, the public health systems that exist in some unique situations like that of Denver Health. And you're famous for using surgical precision to get a CORA request. So can you give us just a brief understanding of what a CORA request is supposed to accomplish and why it exists?
It's supposed to accomplish, and why it exists is simply because it will shine sunlight into areas that in the government that aren't existing at the time. Maybe journalists, the corporate media is not on this story. There are a couple on this story that are doing their job, and I share my records requests with the bigger ones, at least the results of them with Fox.
Right. 31. Explain a CORA request. What is a CORA request?
A CORA request is an Open Records Act request, and it's basically you ask for a document from an agency in the government, or hospitals also have to comply with CORA, and so that you can see what the government is doing, and if they are up to your expectations or not. You can do it to police departments, and that's called a Criminal Justice Record Act request. You simply ask for a document, and they are supposed to respond within 3 days. If not, you tell them that they have a 14-day window to respond, or you're going to sue them. So it's not that difficult to really sue them about these situations, but it's really to shine some sunlight into areas of the government where we're not really getting, where we're getting a lot of darkness, and CDPHE has been bad. I've heard many stories about CDPHE in different ways. So yeah. Does that answer your question? Hello, Brian? Brian? Brian, are you there? Huh. Hello? Okay.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Hi.
Hey, sorry about that. My household internet went out.
Okay.
Lost everything. So there's probably some dead time in there, and I apologize for that. I see we have a few people back. So we were talking about the medical director and CDPHE. This woman recognizing that there were shortages of training and what she wouldn't expect in her units. Right? She said these people are not trained. They didn't have the tools. They didn't have everything they needed to have. You've been saying this well. So the state of Colorado is kind of alluding to some changes coming.
Hopefully.
But you say that there's a sticky line here because when the change comes, there's going to be accountability. And more than one person, not just Elijah McClain, but others have died.
Yeah.
So how do we get clean in this situation?
I'm not too sure because these medical doctors are these are emergency room medical doctors, so they're vital to our the health of our state and country. And we do need them, but they've grown so much power, and it's also the licensed professionals have been allowed to run lawless the past 30 to 50 years. If they want to be lawless, they can. So these doctors have collected so much power that our politicians our politicians just aren't standing up to them, and they're going to have to at some point. And I hope it'll be soon, but I'm not seeing it. So I'm not too sure this is a situation that's really going to come clean. And so I think something's going to happen, but I don't think it's going to be quite enough.
All right.
And I noticed Defend asked a question of what's the biggest reason for CORA denials that I've seen. A lot of the CORA denials, the CORA requests I asked for, I asked if they were, if they are following such and such a law of their duties, and so the biggest reason for denial is I find that they are violating their own laws.
I like your answer because my belief is that the greatest reason for denial is verbiage.
Yeah.
Your verbosity in asking for information is most unique, and I would say that it is not universal. But I do want to say that it's important. It's important this work, and that's what I was trying to get to before the internet went out on me, is that your efforts to ask for the Colorado Opens Records Request Act or the Federal Records Acts, this is a process that people need to take time. And I think what you and I should do is we should probably try to maybe do a little educational piece on that one of these days. But
that would be good.
For the sake of time, basically somebody needs to send an email request to their local hospital and say, I'm curious about how many times you've had to use ketamine in the last year. Would that be good enough?
Well, what we're in this situation, we're really looking at the fire departments and ambulance corporations doing the actual in the field injection. I have also asked for emergency rooms their use of ketamine as well, and want to compare how much is being used in emergency rooms compared to in the field. And we're all guessing, that it's being used more in the field, unsupervised, than it is in the hospitals. But we don't know that for a fact yet.
So one of the things that we have to think about is the anonymity of HIPAA versus statistics, right? So you can't ask for the names of all the people who have had injections, but you could ask a paramedic or a fire department for the number of individuals that they've billed.
Yeah.
Right? There's creative ways to ask for the numbers without asking for the names.
Yeah, I've asked for ketamine logs, and some are trying to hide behind HIPAA and other, because I don't want the names. I just want tell me what day they were injected. A person was injected in your district, and tell me how big the injection was. Was it for pain? Was it for excited delirium? Because pain is usually between 15 and 50 milligrams, while excited delirium is usually between 300 to 500. So it makes a big difference of what they're doing it for, and we don't have any in excited delirium is still a question if it exists, and in these waiver applications from these doctors, they're now using. They're supposed to cite studies on ketamine for why they would want to use it, and they're actually citing intubation rates of 63% and 57% on studies that were done in Minneapolis and other places. So it's why are in the CDP in MPAC is actually coming back saying our intubation rates are only 20 to 30%. So that's really high. Why do we want such a high intubation rate for a cause of a drug? Just let it be. And I think it's creating a bigger problem than it's solving. It's solving anything.
Okay. So I want to focus on this just for the last minute or two here, huh? I've been on for 2 hours already tonight. So individuals who want to get involved should ask their local fire departments, their local paramedic departments across the country, right? Their hometown hospitals. Are you using ketamine?
Yep, and that's their boards too.
Huh?
Those boards. Include those boards of the fire departments, at least with the answers as to what they get. Tell them, this is not, if there is some, use, tell those boards this is not acceptable. Fire departments have boards.
So it's not acceptable at all. You don't want to just know, like, if they're even being trained. We're at this point where ketamine is a dangerous drug. It should not be played with without the medical training necessary to utilize it. And in most circumstances, the professionalism, the experience, the education level that's required to effectively administer ketamine, the checklist of tools, the administering temperature checks, pulse checks, having accurate weight knowledge, underestimating on the use of these things. If you don't have all of this stuff laid out, and you're using this drug, you should pause. You should calculate all of these things and the finances that it is going to be required to effectively and legally use ketamine.
Yeah.
You don't have the money to spend right now to make all of those things happen, then citizens should be demanding an immediate cease of use.
Yes. And and also the three instances of where lawsuits have been filed, McClain, McKnight, and Axtell, all of them were in handcuffs at the time, which means they were under control. And you have to be out of control and a danger to the people around you and yourself to have excited delirium. So that proved right there that these paramedics should have just turned their backs and said, no ketamine here. It can't be done. This is not excited delirium. They are in handcuffs. And even Channel 7 had a fourth incident where ketamine was injected in Aurora. And the guy's hands were clasped behind his back for a while. He could have been in handcuffs, but the cops had obviously chosen not to use handcuffs at the time. So these people are under control, and they can't be under control and have excited delirium. So that should have been a big warning sign, but these, it's just proving these paramedics are not trained.
And I think that's an important factor. Elijah McClain, his life was lost in a very unfortunate setting where every agency has said the people who responded, the methodologies in which they responded, everybody was undertrained.
Yeah.
The police were undertrained. The phone call, the 911 emergency response people, they were undertrained. The cops, everybody didn't have enough training, right? But
you could even say the doctor
get lives back. So a termination of the chemical use of these shortcuts is what we have to demand right now.
Yeah, and it's also being used in the excuses are being used for saying they're protecting police, but you're having a paramedic get within a foot of a person so that they can inject someone with a needle. And the guy with a gun in a radio asking for more people like him to subdue one person while you're asking a paramedic to do it is, it's absurd. Why put the paramedic in that danger if there is a danger? And it just doesn't make any sense. There's better ways to do this than an injection with ketamine.
So, Frank, if somebody sends an email and they get some response that they think is ridiculous, besides emailing me at cuttheplastic@gmail.com, how can they reach you? I'm going to type it out here real quick. So spell it out for me.
Okay. It's my first initial, last name, F Sturgell @yahoo.com.
So I believe that should be it right there on the screen. F Sturgell @yahoo.com. I love those blue glasses, by the way.
Thanks. The address is correct.
Okay. So if you're emailing for inquiries about ketamine, you don't like the response that you get, please don't be shy. Email myself, email Frank. We're going to respond. We're going to get back to you as best as we can. We want to show that this is an issue, that across the country, there's Narcan as an example of a drug that can be utilized to save people's lives in a intentional and a meaningful manner that is not gonna take a life, that any human being can have access to that. So I'm not here on this platform to say that all these drugs, all these tools, all these things are bad, but I know that ketamine is a horse tranquilizer, and you shouldn't have the unlimited access to be out there injecting people if you don't know what you're doing, and you don't have an education and a background with extensive training. And to hear the woman tonight talk about Elijah McClain, the fact that there wasn't enough training, that these people didn't know, and that the institution is still not going to decry ketamine, because that's my takeaway tonight. Yeah, Elijah
Yeah.
McClain should have died, but we still need our ketamine. That's what I heard, and I don't like
Yep.
that. So I hope that you folks out there in the world will join Frank, will join myself in being a voice against the unwanted, unnecessary chemical intrusions that caused the shutdown of mental health facilities in the 80s, right? The testing, the use of chemical drugs. That's why Reagan shut down these facilities. Unfortunately, it's also why so many people who have real mental health issues are living in the streets and they don't have housing. So we've got to get it right. We've got to find these balances where the medicines are used appropriately, but just because somebody's walking down the street, looks at you differently, has in their mind a preconceived notion because of your clothing or your skin color, or as that woman laid out today, the mental perception. You think of something different when you hear of a person passed out at a elementary school versus a bar versus a mall versus a nursing home. And so our implicit bias is automatic, and all of us have that. And training that out of people is possible, but until we have all the tools in place, it's necessary that we take a look at our humanity, and that before we even think about putting tools in place, that we consider the moral responsibilities to taking somebody's life or putting a person's life in hands, and not examining the institutions, the policing that automatically doesn't take the time to observe and investigate from a distance, to park under, just to be driving slowly a half a block back and watching somebody walking down the street dancing and seeing that they just seem like they're just doing their own thing, and they should have the right to get home alive. Now, we know that this has happened to city council representative, their relations, their family members. This happens to people on the streets. This happens to those who have mental health conditions all too regularly.
Yeah.
So reach out to your local organizations and start asking about how much ketamine is being used. It took a while for Vicodin to go from, the oxycodones, the mills, to the companies recognizing the dangers. The people who manufacture ketamine know the risks. But until we show the numbers in our communities, we can't hold them accountable.
Yeah.
Frank,
One of the other risks that I haven't mentioned, I did mention before in the chat, is the contraindications. And one example of that was CPR journalist Allison Sherry went into Denver Health. She had a cut from her blender, so she went into Denver Health to.
Yes, I saw this.
And they first gave her fentanyl. And then they gave her just 15 milligrams of ketamine to kill the pain. And it knocked her out. And the reason for that is, I'm not a pharmacist, because a pharmacist actually told me this, is that ketamine and fentanyl leave the body the same way, but it doesn't, I don't think they did it at the same rate. So that the ketamine couldn't leave the body, because the fentanyl was blocking that exit. So it backed her up and knocked her out. And the doctor that prescribed that should have known that, but he didn't, or she didn't. So that'll be interesting to find out the truth on what happened there.
So there's a lot of this use. We need to expose more of it. Friends, you have the email on your screen. That's Frank Sturgell, our friend and family member. We're glad you're part of the crew and for all the work that you do, Frank.
Thanks.
Absolutely. I'm going to call it, though. I think that we've got a lot to think about after this, and there's a lot of work to do. So this is just for those who are interested, another method of community interaction and involvement to hold the system accountable.
Yeah, and we're going to have to have another show just to get on city councils and legislatures too when those bills come up.
Yes, we're going to do some more on this. Indeed. And I think that there's a lot more methodologies that we can discuss. I think that holding a 2-hour stream, 2.5 hours for me is a long stream. So we're gonna call it a day. And of course, as you know, because you physically were there, this is not the first set of streams for the day. So we'll talk to you soon, Frank. Everybody in the chat, thank you for hanging out. We need justice for Elijah McClain, and we need to fight for the ADA. We need to fight for disabilities, for environmental rights, for mental health rights. There's a lot of life to live and a lot of fighting to do. So we've got to do it with community support. And I'm glad you're part of our community, Frank. You have a great night.
Thank
you.
Okay, you too. Yep.